In this episode of Suspect Zero, the case of Mike DeBardeleben, aka the Mall Passer.
Welcome to episode 4 of Suspect Zero, where we not only discuss unsolved cases, but serial killers whose crimes are lesser known or virtually unknown, yet the most terrifying. I'm Dawn Washburn, and joining me is my co-host, Dr. Michael Arntfield. Hi, Michael.
Good to see you, Dawn, as always. Why don't we jump right into this and talk about this week's lesser-known, zero media footprint, zero name recognition serial killer. And this is a guarantee for our viewers and listeners. Number one, not only the least known. I challenge anybody to have heard of this guy's name before, and yet terrifyingly, perhaps one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And we'll never know all his victims. So why don't you introduce us to this week's Suspect Zero, Dawn?
Okay, so welcome James Mitchell, or Mike DeBardeleben, also known as the Mall Passer.
And that's why nobody's heard of him. A terrible moniker. And here's why. This guy was not. We don't know how many people DeBardeleben has killed. That's such a mouthful, and it's not pronounced how it looks like it's spelled. There's so many letters. This guy was initially a counterfeiter, and one of the most successful lone wolf counterfeiters in U.S. history. A lot of counterfeiting is done through criminal organizations or through groups who have sophisticated ways of getting bills out into circulation. But this guy was a one-man show. This is like Catch Me If You Can. He was a coast-to-coast con artist and counterfeiter. So he initially came into the orbit of police as a counterfeiter, and that's where the name the Mall Passer comes about. But he was never publicly known as a serial killer, so the press never coined him a moniker.
Right, and he was also considered one of the most complete criminals who's ever been arrested in this country, in the United States, anyway. His travels, while he was traveling around, the name Mall Passer was given to him as a result of clearly passing bills at various malls he was going to. But in addition to going to these malls, he was committing other crimes that were unknown to the Secret Service and police at the time when they were searching for just the counterfeiter. So I found it really interesting that he almost, in a way, reminds me of what we do for a living, which is teaching. And he clearly had an objective, but he also would map out his objectives and also his lesson plans, or whatever you want to call it. But I completely mapped this out in my mind, that he became almost like a lesson planner in a way. So he would create a lesson with objectives, and then he would tweak those lessons later if they didn't really. So as we would call it, we would modify a lesson. He would do the same when he was mapping out what he was going to do to his victims. If something didn't work, he would then tweak it, for lack of a better word.
He was a professional criminal through and through, and demonstrated what we call criminal versatility, which is typically a hallmark of psychopathy, and also of, and I hate to use the word successful, but at least prolific serial killers, in that I think there's this misunderstanding that a serial killer's escalation and trajectory is linear, that they start doing, say, torturing animals, and then they move on to fire starting, and then they move on to sexual assaults, and it's not like that. Often sexual homicide, serial homicide emerges from this constellation of other crimes, where they're constantly seeking new thrills and sensations, and there may be a sexual motive to what on the surface seem to be property crimes. Again, we recognize now all the subtypes of sexually motivated burglaries, where often, maybe the laptop and liquor is taken, but that's not why they're in the house. That's just sort of the aftermath. So he is, as you said, dabbling in everything, and that's in part why that obfuscates, that sort of muddies the waters in terms of what's going on as sort of his hobbies. So he's a professional criminal, but then his hobbies are also criminalistic in nature, which are basically rape and murder. So what do we know about that?
So I found it. I'm going to just go back just a second because his method was fascinating. As he would go in, he would take these $20 bills and then he would spend like $1 at the store so he could make the profit by getting back what he received at the store. So, he's traveling all over, so his operation wasn't really centralized, which made it a lot harder for him to get caught. And then during his travels, he was committing, like we said before, more crimes than anyone could have imagined. And so one day he's at the mall and the police had already set it up where they had spoken to the employees and told them, look out for this guy, because he's passing bills everywhere. And so it just so happened that an employee did recognize him this particular day. And she was able to call the police at the moment that he was leaving the store. And as he was leaving the store, they approached him. And the funny thing is he went up to the police and said, "I've already been checked out. They already stopped me. I've already been checked." Thank God they didn't believe him, because then they apprehended him. And once they got into his trunk, they noticed that there was a lot more than they bargained for. In addition to going and searching his house and finding, they were actually looking for the printing press, which they didn't find. And then one of the Secret Service officers was going through the yellow pages, and through the yellow pages, he stumbled on a piece of paper that was slid inside of one of the pages under the storage units section. And so then they went to the storage unit, and there they found the mother lode, and that's where they found, driver's license, women's underwear, rape kits, murder kits. I mean, everything you could, plus the printing press. So it was a huge discovery. And then they knew that they were dealing with something a lot more sinister than just counterfeiting.
Right. So they go and they execute a search warrant on this storage unit, again, looking for the printing press, zeroing in on the fact that this guy's a prolific counterfeiter and very effective. I mean, it took them a while to get onto him. And again, one-man operations able to produce counterfeit bills of this quality had by that point been almost unheard of. So this is what they're looking for. And then no one would have conceived of a counterfeiter also being, in his travels as he's passing these bills, a serial rapist and serial killer. And this really, and we've encountered this in a few more recent cases, but this was really the first case where, so Secret Service calls the FBI. The FBI says, listen, yeah, we're in the serial killer business, but normally we have murders or disappearances where foul play is suspected, and then we link the crimes and we go looking for a perpetrator based on common characteristics and our analysis and profile. Here we have the offender in custody, and we've got all these telltale indicators that he's been killing and torturing and dismembering bodies for years, but we don't know who the victims are, other than in the case of the driver's licenses. And some of these women came back to be confirmed victims of sexual assault, along with his wives, who, he was brutal to his wives. But we don't know how many people he's killed based on just his travel. I mean, we could be talking anywhere from 20 to 200.
And I found it amazing that, there were 3 they know of, which, he would pretend he was Dr. Zack, and Dr. Zack would meet these women, these real estate agents.
That's right.
Which seems, like a sting operation where he would call and ensure that they would be there at a certain time, and then he would execute the plan as he needed. So he was delving in that, but then he was also making sure that he was a police officer as well as Dr. Zack, and he would put lights on his car and pull women over and tell them they were being arrested for something when they knew that they weren't, and then that's when he would assault them, typically in his car. I found it amazing, though, that there's a lot of victims who he did not kill. He let a lot of his victims go.
So yeah, this is something that people get hung up on, where they say, and this came up in the Golden State Killer case. There's X number of people who are attacked, and a certain proportion are murdered, and others survive. And even investigators at the time of these crimes that later become cold cases said, well, these have to be 2 different offenders, because why would he have let them live in this case and not in the other? And we talked about this briefly in episode 1, but this comes down to what's known as victimology. And this is why victimology as a subfield of criminology exists. And it's part of law enforcement research as well, which is how do victims respond to certain stressors? How do victims interact with their tormentors or their perpetrators? What do victims who survive have in common with versus those who do not? And often, and again, there's no way of knowing if you exercise your fight or flight instincts what your attacker will do. I mean, often it's the opposite of what you would expect, and we've seen that in many cases. So there's no way of knowing it, but the end result of each crime ultimately boils down to decisions made by the victim. And again, there's no way of knowing if it's the right decision or wrong decision, and there's no such thing as arbitrary right and wrong under the stress of that incident. But certainly we know that serial killers have said before, when control is lost, or it's not going a certain way. I mean, even Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who is, incredibly sadistic and ritualistic in his crimes once he got into people's homes and a hold of them, allowed, we know at least one victim that he let go. So there was always, whether it's Golden State, Night Stalker, who are actually very similar, or someone like the Mall Passer, DeBardeleben, they make gut instinct decisions the same as everybody else. And there's really no need to emphasize that distinction between who lived and who died. This is part of my teaching with law enforcement, is the MO generally, regardless of the outcome, is what you need to be focusing on. We know that serial killers are very adaptable. Yes, they're routine-driven people, but they also are looking for a certain outcome, and if that can't be met, often they'll abort. What, again, you mentioned DeBardeleben had sort of lesson plans. He'll deviate from the plan.
Right, and something that he had stated, he made goals for himself, which he had tape recorded. So what he wanted to do first and foremost was establish a new identity. And then he wanted to buy a new house where he could include a cage, in that he actually called this the SMB cage, which would be the sadomasochistic bitch cage. In addition to that, his top priority was adding an incinerator to his home so that he could capable of incinerating at extremely high levels to get rid of whatever he was trying to get rid of. And he also wanted enough money to be able to spend it in a year and not have to work at all to get the money, hence the counterfeiting. So he did have some goals that he did, but he documented his crimes pretty significantly, and that's why I made the distinction between who he let go and who he didn't, because that came back to bite him a lot, and so did all of the things that he had seen. He was almost like a hoarder in a way, just keeping all of these trophies, but he also made a rating system of his victims. He would rate them from 1 to 5. I'm assuming on how well they did, but he would really gauge the pain, and he wanted to see the pain. He wanted to see, and then he wanted them to describe the pain. And I remember when I was listening to it, I put myself in the victim's position. Like, what would I do if, and I remember him saying in one of the recordings, explain the pain. Tell me what the pain is like. And I feel like, if I'm already in the position, I don't know, but I feel like I would probably respond, if you want to know what the pain feels like, let me do it to you, because that's what he wanted. He wanted them to describe what they were feeling each time he was putting a cigar out on their back, or ripping their fingernails from their fingers. He just wanted to hear them and create that submission in such a horrific and terrifying way. Mike DeBardeleben was the second of 3 children. He had a younger brother, Ralph, and a younger sister who is not publicly known. At the age of 16, DeBardeleben assaulted his mother, and he also began his criminal career when he purchased handguns with a friend and was later arrested and convicted. He was expelled from high school and did not pursue any further education. Instead, he embarked on a journey that no one would ever expect. Not only was he a counterfeiter, but his secret acts of rape and murder have been described as fitting the pathology of a so-called anger excitation rapist, the kind of rapist who derives pleasure from the suffering of his victims. During DeBardeleben's known sexual assaults, he would approach his victims posing as a police officer. When he had them under control, he would rape them repeatedly and brutally, usually with objects since he couldn't maintain an erection. He had a habit of making his victims call him daddy during the assaults and would sometimes record the acts. Eventually, he was arrested by the Secret Service for counterfeiting, and his other crimes caught up with him, which drew national attention from the FBI. January 26, 2011, while in jail, DeBardeleben died of pneumonia at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina.
So a few things here. Obviously, this whole idea of a dungeon or this oubliette where he can cast his victims and keep them as slaves. This is an improvement, if you want to call it that, upon the dungeon that Charles A. and Leonard Lake had in California a little bit earlier. And they actually dispose of their victims through various means on the property of this sort of isolated. So they would lure couples out posing as sort of outdoor ranch hands to the property, kill the men and keep the women as slaves, and then both bodies would be burned, smashed up, and scattered around the property. So we see that DeBardeleben actually wants to use a commercial incinerator and leave no evidence outside. So he's learning. So serial killers aren't sort of in dialogue or in competition with each other, but they certainly are keenly aware of their pathology in many cases, and they've looked at the methods used by other serial killers. So there's no question that their MO influenced DeBardeleben. The other thing that strikes me is, in terms of paraphilias, here's a guy who is a textbook, and we're going to be talking about a lot of these, sexual sadist. So this is someone who, and this is what makes them so dangerous, is essentially their sexual orientation and gender identity is what we call polymorphic, meaning there is no single type. All they need is male or female, child or adult, a body to terrorize and to defile and to often destroy and mutilate. And what we know about sexual sadists is, even if it's not overtly sexual, they don't have a victim that they're doing this to for sexual gratification. And the term sadism, of course, comes from Marquis de Sade. And it was based, the diagnosis, if you will, was sort of came about in the late 19th century from an Austrian psychiatrist who had read 120 Days of Sodom, which was a secret manuscript that de Sade had written about these four sadists who take a bunch of slaves to a castle and spend 120 days raping and torturing them. And then it ends in a bloodbath, basically, for fun, and just because they can. So Sade becomes sadism, which is sexual gratification through causing pain, terror, or humiliation. And what we know is sadists, even if it's not overtly sexual, like in the case of DeBardeleben's rapes and tortures, they find sort of subtle gratification in just tormenting people day in and day out. There'll be abusive bosses. The idea of passing counterfeit bills, and maybe someone at the mall has to pay out of their paycheck for having accepted that bill. That will be very gratifying to him. He'll probably masturbate to that idea. And this is why sexual sadists often tend to be very, again, diverse in their criminality, because they will seek out sensations through a variety of crimes, and then sort of their reward or their ideal crime is something that involves a kidnapped victim. But they'll find there's all kinds of rehearsal crimes or afterglow crimes that, again, don't necessarily look sexual, including armed robbery, which he also dabbled in, but they are to the sadist. And we also know that sadists place great value on not only sights and sexual experiences, but all sensory experiences. So that includes sound. They love audio recording, if not video recording. So the toolbox killers are notorious for having audio recorded the screams of their victims and replaying them for, again, masturbatory purposes. But they love hearing people, like you said, describe things. And this goes back to 120 Days of Sodom, the book written in the 18th century, where these four sadists who are raping and torturing men, women, and children in this castle get ideas about what to do to them from a group of women that they bring to the castle who used to be prostitutes and had been abused, and they want to hear stories about the pain that they endured to inspire them to do this to other people. So DeBardeleben is a real case study on the fact that sadists are not only visual, but perhaps more importantly place this emphasis on sound. And there's actually another disorder for that called Acousticophelia, which is sexual arousal from sound, specifically from sounds of people being terrorized or tortured.
I think just playing off of that, when he was in court and he was defending himself, like, you know, this was another Bundy follower, but he represented himself in court, and while he was in court, he played the tapes over and over for the victims to listen to while they were in court. And it was stated that he was doing that on purpose, again, to gain more control, even though you're the witness. Like, she had to face him in court. You know, she had to be questioned by him. So she's reliving it all over again. And you can almost see the look on his face that he was deriving pleasure from even playing those recordings in court to the victim again. You know, so that was something that was a little bit, you know, another domineering yet terrifying thing that the victim probably had to face.
And it's not only the victim, but everyone who was present in court. Right. The idea, the look on their face and hearing it, I mean, this would have been an extraordinarily sort of pleasurable, as twisted as that sounds, experience for him, which is why, representing himself, he would have had complete control over the ability to, again, draw out the pleasure that he took from terrifying people. This just occurred to me now, but another interesting example of this is the FX series Fargo, season 1. Billy Bob Thornton's character, who we're not entirely sure, he sort of straddles the line between the secular world and maybe something supernatural. There's something preternatural about him, but he is a sadist essentially who travels the country, infiltrates people's lives and destroys them through both violence as well as just financial devastation, breaking up their marriages. And then when these people basically have a breakdown, he auto records it, and then there's this chilling scene where he's just got this case of cassettes upon cassettes, which are people's lives that he's destroyed, and he listens to them for pleasure at night and relives it. And it's a pseudo-sexual experience. So again, Roy Hazelwood, who is the pioneer of profiling serial sexual murderers at the FBI, has said, if someone is a sadist, if that is your hardwiring, you can't be fixed. You cannot be rehabilitated or corrected. That's like trying to tell someone that, you're his age and that is sex, that is your identity. You cannot undo that. That bell cannot be unrung. And other than child molesters and necrophiles, who are sort of often within the same spectrum, it is the most uncorrectable of paraphilias. So when you have a serial killer who is a sexual sadist, they will not stop until they are caught. And thankfully, his greed with the counterfeiting got him caught, because I'm not sure, we still don't know how many people he's killed. He would have continued to operate in secrecy for years.
Oh, yeah. Roy Hazelwood, actually, adding to that, had said that there's no way that he remained dormant. No. So you're seeing a span of where the victims, between the time that they were either approached or the next one was murdered or the next crime took place, he said there was never really a dormant time. You just didn't catch what he was doing. And you don't really know all the like you said, you don't really know the victim. So there's really was no dormancy anywhere in his spree. And he also called him an anger excitation rapist. And he classified him there where he, growing up, he had a very domineering mother, but his father was kind of like the weaker of the two. So the mother really took the role. And I have to wonder, how a lot of times we keep coming back to either a domineering mother, a mother who left the child or neglected them. Is this a huge factor in this? Or, is it nature versus nurture? Is it the opposite? I find myself struggling to figure out, are you born into this? Because if you are, I mean, what do you do with that? What do you know?
Well, I mean, it's a combination of nurture and nature. I mean, this is why, if you remember the Las Vegas massacre shooter, Stephen Paddock, his brain was sent to Stanford Medical School for analysis because his father was a bank robber, and the thought was his psychopathic tendencies. So he wasn't necessarily a sadist or sexual sadist, but certainly, I mean, antisocial and perhaps psychopathic traits. Could he have inherited this from his father? Could there be diminished frontal lobe development in the brain that would explain his behavior, and then it'd be largely congenital or a force of nature? So the jury's still out on that. Same thing with Jeffrey Dahmer. I mean, his parents, believe it or not, at last word, so the Milwaukee cannibal killed in prison, his parents are in a custody battle over who gets his brain to study. And the thought is, again, maybe there's an explanation because there is nothing overt in his childhood, not as much as other serial killers, but there are people with diminished frontal lobe activity in their brain who lack, certain elements of empathy, who are not sexual serial murderers or sadists. There are people who come from broken homes or henpecking, domineering mothers who are not serial sexual murderers. So there is no single determinant, and that's where I caution students and law enforcement. Things can be correlated. They are not necessarily causal. And even if something is causal, so you have diminished frontal lobe activity in your brain, so you have diminished empathy, that is not deterministic. That is not something that you can necessarily overcome. So really, serial killers, especially sadists, as like the, among the most rare of serial killers and certainly sexual murderers, I mean, they are true singularities, and there is no single determinant. They represent a constellation of forces that both nature and nurture create these abominations. And that's why they're so, A, fascinating, and B, so difficult to identify until they begin offending. Although, again, there's some telltale markers in other areas of their lives that I've talked about: the bullying, the enjoyment in again, whether it be something obvious like torturing an animal as a child. There are other giveaways. There are other signposts. But long story short, broken homes, domineering mothers, transience in childhood. That's another again, correlated variable, not necessarily causal. It's just, it does show up, like you said, in a lot of these guys' life histories.
Yeah, and he seemed to be somebody, and I don't like to classify because I don't know if I have the, if I should be doing that, but he reminded me of someone with obsessive compulsive disorder too, because the endless listing, I mean, the notes that they found and just everything just really mapped out so meticulously. He was a very organized killer.
Highly organized.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I felt. Did you feel the same?
Again, very similar to Charles Ng and Leonard Lake, where they kept sketches of their victims. They kept detailed plans. They had a rules list that their victims would have to acknowledge. I mean, fastidious, rigorous documentarians of their crimes. And this was all in my book, published in 2017, Murder in Plain English, about serial killers and mass murderers' relationships with stories they either diarize about themselves or stories that have influenced their crimes. And some of those stories we're going to be talking about as part of this podcast, that whereby whether it's OCD or whether it's just part of their grandiosity and narcissism, they need to document. It's almost like they want to create this literary legacy for the horror that they've inflicted, even if no one else reads it. Again, it's something that, and that is also sadistic. I mean, if you look at Albert Fish, the Werewolf of Wisteria, this is among the first serial killers to begin writing taunting letters. And he was a child killer who wrote to the families of his victims. And, fast forward a few decades and you've got, the Zodiac, the Son of Sam, and this becomes sort of standard issue for some of these guys. And that's the writing is reliving the crime for them. For our viewers and listeners, what do we think the span of DeBardeleben's crimes, I mean, specifically the murders, were?
The timing
Yeah,
in which
the years.
he was doing this? So it was, I believe it was, his first was 1966.
First confirmed. So we
Confirmed.
don't know. So
We don't even really know.
right.
So
So I mean, this guy was at it for decades, and
Right.
then is finally arrested. So just for our listeners and viewers, Don, what do we think? I mean, his first confirmed murder was in 1966. He's not arrested until 2007?
7. I
For
believe it was 7.
For the counterfeiting. I mean, so again, these guys don't go dormant. We know of maybe 6 victims. I'm thinking, I mean, it has to be in the hundreds. I mean, because he's got dozens and dozens of known rapes, other crimes. He was all over the country, coast to coast, passing bills. And again, that's his job. But and then he was.
I think that was a huge reason why it was so difficult to find out who he was, and that he was simultaneously committing these crimes. So he's passing the counterfeit bills in addition to murdering or assaulting women as he goes along. So when the police actually sort of figured this out and were looking at all the driver's license that he collected, because he actually went to a bar and was talking to a woman, and I remember her saying that she was very creeped out by him. But she realized that her driver's license was missing from her purse. But in addition to that, her whole entire purse was reorganized. So he went in and kind of like organized her things, you know? And then I started looking at how he was connected to his wives and the grooming of his wives, because he really wanted them to become isolated from their families, from their friends. And then he would groom them, and he would perform these acts on them to see what kind of response he was, eliciting.
Yeah, he's using his wives as to practice basically what later become lethal torture techniques and bondage techniques. So, I mean, you can imagine in the 70s, a nomadic lone wolf. He's not telling anybody about his crimes. He's not working with anybody who can dime him out or serve as a witness or turn state's evidence. He's going coast to coast in a pre-digital era, passing bills, raping and murdering random people. And those crimes still aren't fully connected. Now that, again, they've all been input into various digital databases, including the one that we've got at murderdata.org, the Murder Accountability Project. And because they span so many years and so many different jurisdictions, there really is, I mean, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, should be linking them, but doesn't seem to be, because he's that diverse. And no one knew he existed until that search warrant, as a killer, until that search warrant was executed after 2007. So you can imagine 40 years of doing this. And that's the other thing we know about sadists, is they do not age out. They do not diminish in their, I mean, Albert Fish, who I mentioned before, was, I mean, in his 50s and 60s doing this. So, I mean, far beyond what the mean or median age of most sexual murderers is. So the candle never really burns out, which is why they are dangerous up till essentially the time that they're dead. Even if, I mean, you'll hear people say, well, you know, he's 80, we should, you know, look at day parole. They are still a risk. And this guy's a case in point. And it's just interesting to me, and this is why we do this podcast, is people talk about Bundy as, you know, this, you know, he was on the road, you know, this commuter killer, this chameleon, you know, who traveled state to state and was always one step ahead. DeBardeleben's way ahead of him. I mean, had probably killed 100 people by the time Bundy claimed his first victim. And yet, for whatever reason, Bundy's the name everyone remembers, whereas these are the killers we need to study to better understand what drives these abominations.
Agreed.
All right. Well, that's a lot of heavy unpacking for both of us and listeners, but I would urge everybody to look up this case to learn more. And again, what we try to offer here is takeaways that will help you not only learn more about crime and justice, but to live safely. So, and to recognize threats, because all of these suspect zeros we're talking about have other victims, living victims, who they've also destroyed. And if you can keep these people out of your lives and recognize the warning signs, the telltale markers, then all the better.
Again, thank you for your insight, and it's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Dawn Washburn with my co-host, Dr. Michael Arntfield. See you next time on Suspect Zero.
In the next episode of Suspect Zero, the murder mystery of Jeanette De Palma.